Peter Teflon Distinguished Professor of Borderlands History. That is a title that will make you stop and take notice, particularly the distinguished part. Not everyone can live up to the distinguished designation, but our next speaker handles the title with ease from his presence and demeanor to the exercise of his profession. Caballero de fina estampa, as we would say in Spanish, a gentleman of the old school. His high standing in Texas and abroad is signaled by the honors he has received from the governments of Spain and Mexico. His broad range of interests is reflected in the scope of his teaching areas, which range from the Spanish borderlands to Texas history, colonial Latin American history, and the history of imperial and modern Spain. He will not be signing books, but if you want his autograph, I'm sure he'll be happy to oblige. A man for all seasons, please welcome to speak on the subject of the legacy of Spanish and Mexican Texas and overlapping societies, the distinguished Dr. Felix Almaraz, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't sign books, not because I don't like to. It's just I don't have an agent. I don't have a business, a bookkeeper to take care of all these things, and so I travel light. No pun intended. It is truly a unique experience to celebrate in the same year of 2010 the observance of two landmark events in North American history. First, the bicentennial of the outbreak of Father Miguel Hidalgo's insurgency against the Spanish crown that culminated in the inauguration of Mexican nationhood. And second, the promulgation of Francisco Ignacio Madero's Plan de San Luis Potosí, concluded and printed in San Antonio, that inflamed the upheaval of the modern Mexican Revolution. Both cataclysmic events provided a canopy for the overarching theme that Mark Lambert and his advisors crafted for my consideration. The sequence of words struck a multitude of respondent chords in my consciousness that suggested strands that could be braided into the legacy of Spanish and Mexican Texas and the overlapping societies. The treasure troves curated in the special collection of the General Land Office of Texas are replete with instructional materials for social studies and history teachers who possess imagination and moral courage to supplement the curricular design approved by the Texas Education Agency and the checklist of textbooks adopted by the State Board of Education. The pervasive thread that characterizes the archival holdings of the host institution is land, as Dr. Cummings pointed out. Land grants, land agents, empresarios, petitions for land, descriptions of land defined by varas, dulas, and suertes, etc. There is an earlier perspective to land in the form of place name geography bestowed by Capitan Alonso de Leon the Younger, first governor of Coahuila. In the 17th century, the Nahuatl word Coahuila intrigued Spanish explorers and amateur anthropologists who postulated a nebulous thesis that it evolved from a composite of coa, meaning snake or serpent, and huila, signifying wings. The application of Coahuila to the landscape referred to the sloping terrain east of the Sierra Madre Oriental called El Gran Coahuila, or the habitat of winged snakes. Eventually, anthropological studies in northern Mexico superseded the primitive folklore. Owing to the arid terrain of the central corridor, flanked by the eastern and western ranges of the Sierra Madre, Coahuila signified a basin of fertile irrigated land located adjacent to a flowing river, accented by clusters of tall trees. dispatched in 1687 to explore the territory east of the Rio Grande in search of survivors of the ill-starred encroachment upon the coastland led by the Sieur de la Salle, Alonso de Leon blazed early trails into Texas that stretched eastward to the Whistling Pines situated in the wetlands of the province. In the course of 4 entradas, 2 along the coast that revealed the location of La Salle's fortification and its ultimate destruction by hostile natives, and 2 more through the interior of the country, De Leon applied identity to the geography that ranged from descriptive to possessive, and from incidental then to commemorative. Examples of place names for each of the foregoing categories include the following applications. Descriptive names recorded the appearances or quality of place, such as Rio Colorado, a name derived from ochre or sand deposits near the riverbank that the velocity of the current transformed into a reddish hue. Rio Hondo, a nomenclature that emphasized profundity of a river channel after the runoff of summer rains drained into a basin. Rio Atascoso, that contributed to endless delays at river crossings because of the adhesive content of the clay deposits in the environment. Possessive names identified a place with a person, group, or wildlife, which transformed a location into a place of habitat. Rio Angelina. In the woodlands of the eastern border, Angelina was the daughter of a chieftain whom the Franciscan missionaries attached to the De Leon expedition baptized with that given name. Arroyo de Leon. On the 3rd entrada in 1688, farther north into the interior, explorers found the carcass of a bobcat, or gato montes, or possibly that of a mountain lion, a puma. As other explorers before and after who found themselves on the outer rim of civilization, described as a concho, Alonso de Leon succumbed to the temptation of ascribing his own surname to the uncharted creek, Arroyo de Leon. Incidental names were associated with memorable encounters or particular dates. The Rio Nueces was the first water ford east of the Rio Grande that the expedition of 1689 encountered. The clusters of tall pecan trees and the abundance of nuts, combined with the footpaths on the ground, convinced the members of the De Leon expedition that native Coahuiltecas and wild game, especially squirrels and raccoons, habitually frequented the region. Before traversing the river to continue the search for La Salle, Captain De Leon directed responsible non-commissioned officers to chop a marker on the bark of a tall nogal. Mounted on horses to achieve higher visibility, not only for themselves, but for later travelers, the sergeant selected a crucifix about the size of a hand, which one of them nailed in the notch of the tree to signify a safe passage along El Camino Real that they were blazing into the terra incognita. The nomenclature of Camino Real evolved from a corporate status of the combined military missionary expedition that escribanos, clerks or scribes, and other members identified as El Real. As the expedition advanced farther into the wilderness, the tracks or ruts they left behind, later sojourners referred to the route blazed by earlier patrols as El Camino del Real, which by 1691 and 1772 became compressed into, El Camino Real. Rio Frio. On the entrada of 1688, after crossing the Rio Grande, the expedition ascended the rolling llanos, where they encountered the upper tributaries of the Rio Nueces. East of the Nueces, in the waning weeks of winter, they reached the bank of an uncharted river. Temporarily delayed, searching unsuccessfully for a convenient ford, De Leon designated 2 volunteers to dismount and uncoil a length of rope that could be extended from bank to bank to effect a safety line for the entire party. Securing one end of the riata to his waist, the first soldier jumped into the river. Shocked by the frigid running water, he exclaimed, "Está muy frío," Subsequently, when all members of the entrada had crossed to the opposite bank, the escribano recorded a name to the river Rio Frio. Farther ahead, the group came upon another unnamed waterway. Captain de Leon inaugurated a fourth category for place name geography. The new category was commemorative, to honor persons, abstract concepts, or other location. Evidently, Captain de Leon had devoted ample reflection to ascribing commemorative names to the geography. In memory of his mathematics teacher in Spain, the governor resolved to name the river in the central region in honor of Maestro Pedro de Medina. Earlier on the entrada of 1687, he invoked the safety of the expedition to Our Lady of Guadalupe, the image of which adorned the group's military banner. Accordingly, he named the second major river east of the Rio Grande, Rio de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe, or simply Rio Guadalupe. Proceeding along the coast in search of La Salle, the explorers who probed the mystery of the interior of the province reported to the governor that beyond the Rio Colorado was another major waterway. In the more distant interior, a new river had two sources of water that formed a configuration resembling the two outstretched arms of the crucified Christ. De Leon named the river Brazos de Dios, later abbreviated to Rio Brazos. Continuing eastward, the governor's subordinate officers disclosed the location of three tributaries that converge into a big river to which De Leon applied the nomenclature of Rio Trinidad that later generations of settlers amended to Trinity River. On the last entrada of 1689, De Leon's expedition penetrated the piney woods, where they established two frontier missions, the first of which they named San Francisco de los Tejas. In all of the expeditions the governor conducted in search of La Salle east of the Rio Grande, he recruited Franciscan missionaries from the Apostolic College of Santa Cruz de Querétaro. Founded in 1683 to train missionary friars for service to the crown and the cross in remote outposts of the empire, Santa Cruz de Querétaro functioned as the prototypical institution out of which evolved a system for administering spiritual enterprises such as San Francisco de los Tejas and Santísimo Nombre de María. Installed as resident missionary of the first outpost, Fray Damián Massanet, an alumnus of Santa Cruz, had accompanied De Leon on all previous expeditions into Texas. His assignment to the expedition was not by the draw of the lottery. De Leon recruited him because of the friar's facility with the French language. If the objective of the entrada was to find survivors of La Salle's expedition along the coastline, De Leon had planned to use Fray Massanet to interpret for the expedition. The missionary presence in East Texas fluctuated over time. All the same, one outpost, San Francisco de los Tejas, reflected that fluctuation. It was founded, abandoned, refounded, and finally transferred. Even so, it has fluttered like a beacon in archival depositories. Curated among the treasures of the General Land Office of Texas are land tenure documents dated 1823, associated with Mission San Francisco de la Espada. Notwithstanding its migratory character, Mission San Francisco de la Espada is renowned as the first spiritual foundation in Texas. As a teacher, researcher, and writer, I am compelled to clarify misconceptions about Franciscan missions. First, although the Crown of Spain provided the financial support, and the Franciscans, as members of the Catholic Church, managed them, the foundations belong neither to the Crown nor to the Church. The missions belong to the indigenous people for whom they were founded. Next, the Church and state did not intend for the status of missions to be permanent. From the date of foundation, another date in the future was anticipated for its secularization, meaning its transformation from an ecclesiastical institution to a public space. The purpose of a mission in a frontier environment was to stimulate spiritual and temporal growth. The open space within a mission compound, the plaza, was the teaching center, where the native converts received instruction in temporal and spiritual matters in order for them to assume civic responsibility for the management of the community. As evidence of this intent, when the older Texas missions were secularized in the 1790s, it turned out that the only community to be completely secularized was San Antonio de Valero. Fray Jose Francisco Lopez, on the 22nd of August, 1793, personally conveyed the ecclesiastical records of the former mission San Antonio de Valero to San Fernando Church. The four downriver missions, Concepcion, San Jose, San Juan Capistrano, and San Francisco de la Espada, continued as semi-secularized institutions because of a lack of diocesan priests to accept responsibility for the spiritual welfare of the new vecinos. A vecino symbolized an adult, responsible, property-owning member of the community. A final observation about missions. Some historians in the last century committed three errors in their assessments. First, they tended to count statistical records of converts or neophytes under instruction as standards of success or failure. A second error or misconception was to evaluate the primary objective of the mission solely, quote, to Christianize the Indians. The inculcation of doctrinal values constituted about 5% of the entire process. The major objective of the missions was the conversion of the neophytes to a Spanish way of life, which was defined as a sedentary, hardworking presence in one location. The five stair steps of the mission process were: first, misión or mission, the intellectual, spiritual, and moral decision to establish a mission in a frontier environment. Second, reducción or congregation, the gathering of nomadic indigenous people into one location to commence the process of changing a wilderness lifestyle. Third, conversion, the most difficult phase in the process, changing the behavioral patterns of the indigenous people from wanderers of the wilderness to residents of a mission. Some critics of the mission system alluded to the tyranny of the bell. The ringing of the mission bell announced a sequence of instructional activities in the daily schedule from pre-dawn to nightfall. Conversion varied from one neophyte to another. This step involved teaching the vocational arts to the mission converts: farming, carpentry, stonemasonry, animal husbandry, and the use of equipment and vocabulary for managing livestock on horseback, agriculture, harvesting, weaving, blacksmithing, leather tanning, baking and cooking, basket weaving, crafts and music, and daily participation in the Christian liturgy. Sunday was reserved for rest. Christian doctrine or doctrina. The introduction of precepts of Christian doctrine required patience and renewal. This process included instruction in abstract concepts of a European doctrine. The final stair step in the process was secularization. Ideally, after a quarter century of successfully learning experiences in the conversion cycle, a mission ended its existence and became a pueblo and a parish. However, in a frontier environment, with cycles of progress, reversals by epidemics, and aggression by hostile natives, and renewal, the ideal of 25 years was unrealistic. The average tenure of some Texas missions varied from 50 to 70 years. Some historians evaluated the mission saga as, quote, a successful failure. Such assessment, based on statistics of mission converts, material progress, and length of tenure, ignore the spiritual aspect of the enterprise. Church leaders valued the conversion of souls as a higher priority than the statistics of temporal progress. At the time of final secularization of the older Texas missions, the Apostolic College, a new one, Guadalupe de Zacatecas, continued to support 3 coastal missions: Nuestra Señora de la Bahía de Zúñiga, Nuestra Señora de Loreto, and Nuestra Señora del Refugio. Mission records curated in the archives of Zapopan, near Guadalajara, disclose that as late as the mid-1820s, college administrators maintained a special file labeled Tarahumara y Texas. What was the rationale for linking the evangelization of natives along the Texas coast with indigenous peoples of distinct cultures living in the craggy mountain fastness of the western Sierra Madre between Sonora and Chihuahua? At first glance of the documents, a connection did not seem logical. Then, upon careful comparison and review of several documents, 2 salient developments leaped out. First, both mission fields continued to receive supply caravans on a regular basis, a development that signified that Franciscan leaders in the college and in the field considered the spiritual welfare of the converts more important than the temporal necessity. Next, the ages of Franciscan personnel assigned to Texas seemed younger than the ones in Tarahumara. Then, whatever the name of a Franciscan in Texas, whenever that name of a Franciscan in Texas disappeared from the roster, initially I interpreted the rotation of missionaries out of Texas and noted the names of incoming replacements as simply a routine phenomenon. Then I studied the lengthy roster for personnel of Tarahumara. When the names of Franciscans formerly assigned to Texas consistently reappeared in the rosters for Tarahumara, a tentative conclusion seemed plausible. Younger Franciscans came to Texas, gained a few years of experience working among the converts in the 3 coastal missions, and then got reassigned to the more challenging outposts in the mountain wilderness of the Tarahumara Range. Just before the date of 1834, the year when the successor Mexican government terminated all support for the missions of New Mexico and Alta California, the supply caravans for Texas and Tarahumara faded from the records. In 1821, when Mexican insurgents finally achieved the elusive goal of independence from Spain, what changed and what remained? Allegiance to Mexican nationhood superseded loyalty to the Spanish crown. Gradually, by 1824, the former provinces of New Spain became states of Mexico. Some former interior provinces, such as Nueva Vizcaya and Nuevo Santander, assumed new identities, Chihuahua and Tamaulipas, respectively. The civil villa of San Fernando, founded in 1731 by settlers from the Canary Islands, became absorbed into the larger and politically more powerful capital of San Antonio de Béjar. And in my haste, when I left home at 5:30, I forgot to put on my lapel pin from the Villa of Béjar. 5 B's from abejas, lots of them in the environment. And so from those bees, then the name Béjar evolved. In 1827, the once independent province of Texas lost its separate status in the merger with the more populous state of Coahuila y Texas. The multitude of land records curated in the General Land Office of Texas reflect that political reality. Much of the place name geography that originated in the Spanish legacy, with a few modifications, continued into the Mexican era. For the most part, family relationships remained upon the land. Records denoting conveyances of land tenure retained the usage of varas, dulas, and suertes. The old Camino Real continued as a route of ingress and egress, but with a notable exception, or an exclusion. De los Texas was never part of the nomenclature. In 1772, with the Bourbon reforms for the administration of the interior provinces of New Spain, the central route from Zacatecas north to New Mexico became El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The route extending north by northeast from Saltillo through the eastern provinces, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Nuevo Santander, and Texas, became El Camino Real de Tierra Afuera del Oriente. A notable change in municipal administration following the creation of the dual state of Coahuila y Texas was the elimination of the once prestigious office of alcalde and the emergence of the nebulous grade of jefe político. It kind of reminds me of when I was in the Army. I could understand what a sergeant was. I aspired to be a sergeant. I was all on that cutting edge of becoming a sergeant. When somebody in the War Department came up with this thing about specialists. No more respect. And so that kind of reminds me of the jefe político. Alcalde, they understood what it meant for many years, but jefe político was something else. A tradition associated with the livestock industry in the Llanos, overlapping Texas and Tamaulipas, was the branding of cattle, horses, and mules, and the practice of meticulously recording the designs of the brands in a field notebook. The empresario system that originated in the twilight years of Spanish Texas continued into the Mexican era and into the years of the Republic of Texas. Those legacies of Spain and Mexico in North America continue to offer challenges to teachers and to students. For starters, I suggest tapping the smaller treasure troves in non-current records in county courthouses, followed by subsequent initiatives in the vast holdings of the General Land Office of Texas. Be concerned, not worried, about ongoing developments in state government. Be informed, but do not panic. With or without deficits or surpluses, take courage in the initiative of saving Texas history. Together, let us resolve to work through research, teaching, composition, and dissemination of new perspectives of the Texas heritage. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your indulgence and attention. Thank you for the memory of this wonderful morning. God bless you. God bless Texas. Muchas gracias y muy buenas tardes.
It's always a good day when you can learn new things, and I think we've learned a lot this morning. Future symposiums are going to have a hard time matching the level of erudition and expertise that we've gathered for this initial Save Texas History Symposium. I hope you all have some questions. This is the time to ask them. We have people around with these stick mics. Raise your hand and someone will come over and bring the mic to you. I have a question for anyone in the panel that wants to answer it. It's about a legacy that Spain or Mexico could have left. It might have been a temporary legacy, but it didn't happen. And I'm talking about slavery. Anybody want to talk about the fact that Mexico allowed, or the institution of slavery was allowed under Mexican Texas, although it was abolished in other parts of the Republic in 1829, I believe. Does anyone want to talk about how slavery came into Texas?
I'm not a lawyer, but I'll take a crack.
All right, well, you get the first crack at it. Mr. Cummings gets to think about, Dr. Cummings gets to think about his answer. He'll come up next. We probably need the mic up here because, yeah.
Slavery was outlawed by presidential decree in 1829 by Vicente Guerrero, but since he did not have a long tenure in office, it kind of went backward a little bit. Then came the law of April 6, 1830, which was promulgated by a successor administration, and it was rather conservative, and that law included a provision that slavery was not to be tolerated in the terrain of Texas. The trouble with law is the lawyers. And here these people with good intentions coming to Stephen F. Austin's colony, Green DeWitt's, and they were stopped at the border, and they were asked, do you have any slaves? If they said yes, it's, well, you can't bring slaves because it's against the law. Well, what are we going to do? We've traveled so far. And invariably out of the woodland, some lawyer popped up in there and said, if you will retain me, I will tell you how you can do this. They didn't have money, coin of the realm, but they did have chattels, and so they contracted a lawyer, and so the lawyer then would advise them, here's a piece of paper. You sign a 99-year labor contract with those people that are there. You do not have slaves. You have contract laborers. And that created tensions, especially with Colonel John Davis Bradburn from Kentucky, who he was a filibuster, and he found himself full employment opportunities in the Mexican army. And he supported the administration that had appointed him, the Bustamante administration, and so he was going to enforce that law of April 6, 1830. There was one individual who had nothing to do with slavery, but he got caught in the vortex there. His name was Francisco Madero. Francisco Madero was the brother of Evaristo Madero. And Francisco Madero from Chihuahua came over here as a land surveyor. And so he was out there surveying lands, and he founded installed the municipality of Liberty. Some slaves from Louisiana heard that here in Texas, slavery was not allowed by law. And so they ran away, crossed the river, and as soon as they crossed the river, then they were free. Colonel John Davis Bradburn then impressed them into his workforce there, and going to pay him a salary. They were out there doing public works projects. Two lawyers came representing the slave owners back in Louisiana, William Barrett Travis and Patrick Jack, and they agitated before the colonel. The colonel was a man of very little patience. He suffered fools very, very lightly. He arrested them and threw them in jail. And that created more tensions. And slavery became an emotional issue. In the PBS film Seguin, I was an advisor to that, they do have a scene in there where young Juan Seguin is concerned about the importation of slaves. The older generation, represented by Erasmo Seguin, Jose Antonio Navarro, that you cannot develop Texas unless you bring in slaves, because these people are coming in to help develop the area. In the movie, Stephen F. Austin asked Juan Seguin about Cruz Arrocha, who is on the Seguin Ranch and performs work. And Stephen asked young Juan Seguin, what about Cruz Arrocha? Do you pay him a salary? Why, no, he's always been here. I was not at the final meeting over in Los Angeles when we reviewed the script, but I would have added one more line in there. Cruz has the ability to come and go. He is not a slave. He can leave when he wants to. But they didn't put that line in there. And so it left the argument fall on the side of the justification of the rationale for having slaves in Texas. Otherwise, how could it develop? Kind of reminds me of some kindergarten teachers I once supervised, and they had to have aides. That's AIDS, assistant. And one of them came to me after working, she was a good teacher, and it was hard to get those kindergarten endorsements. And she came and said, Dr. Almaraz, I want to get promoted. I said, what do you mean you want to get promoted? I want to be a first grade or second grade teacher. My friends, they think I don't have any ambition. I've been teaching kindergarten. I said, well, I'll go speak to the superintendent. It took some effort to convince him, but he said, all right, if she wants to move up to first or second grade, then you can do that. I told her that, and she said, may I keep my aid? I said, no, aids are for the kindergarten. They don't go to first grade or second grade. But how am I going to get the work done? I said, I guess if you go back to being a kindergarten teacher, then you can keep your aid.
Dr. Cummins, you want to take a stab at it?
Well, that's impossible to follow. I must admit, sometimes when I'm teaching a class, I have this recurring nightmare. I'm teaching a class. I wake up and find that I am. And so unlike Dr. Almaraz, let me say that Don Felix is exactly correct. I would go one further step and say that for the Anglo-American planters in Texas, in the late 1820s, after 1829, into the 1830s, the prohibition against slavery as a legal institution was virtually meaningless, in the sense that prior to 1829, most people that came to Texas brought slaves with them. That was certainly true in Spanish Louisiana a generation earlier. Texas was on its way to becoming an empire for slavery as a cottonocracy. And the labor contract is certainly the way, at least in terms of the viewpoint locally of the institution, it existed. But one of the things that most people don't realize is that the owners of substantial slave populations in Texas in the 1830s owned these slaves by means of conveyances and contracts which had been negotiated in places like New Orleans, Natchitoches, and St. Louis. And so under the laws of the United States, these slaves were still legal property in terms of there being potential chattels against mortgages. For example, on the plantations of Jared Gross, near present-day Hempstead, on the plantations of the lower Brazoria reaches that included places such as Peach Point, most of the slaves on those plantations had not been born to Texas. They came to Texas from the United States, and the legal conveyances, essentially their titles of ownership, were on file in most of the courthouses and parishes of the United States. For example, after the devastating cholera epidemic of 1833 that wiped out much of the lower Brazos Valley cotton crop because of the hardships of bringing in the crop, most planters had to borrow lots of money. James Franklin Perry, Stephen F. Austin's brother-in-law, instructed his New Orleans bankers to borrow money on the conveyance chattels of all of the Peach Point slaves which were held in the New Orleans notary archives. So as far as the New Orleans factors and bankers were concerned, there were legal slaves in Texas, and it was on the basis of them as collateral that he received, as other Brazoria County planters did, loans for the 1834 cotton crop. So I would submit that the actual legal prohibition against slavery, both on the ground basis and in terms of a legal basis, were virtually meaningless.
All right, we don't want to waste the opportunity to fathom the depths of these gentlemen's knowledge, so anybody have a question? There's one at the back.
Thank you, and thank you to all the presenters. I'm Rudy Tejano Peña from Corpus Christi, Texas. I'm a Tejano cultural historian, and I've been trying to convey a message to my fellow Tejanos that we actually exist here in Texas, that we have an identity all ours. And when I saw this announcement that this was going to be going on, about 2 months ago, 3 months ago, I jumped at the opportunity to attend. And as I see the sign, and I looked at what it says, exploring, Spanish and Mexican Texas, I was wondering, in the next time when we do this, we can say exploring Spanish, Tejano, and Mexican Texas. And the reason why I wrote down is for the inclusion of the Tejano term is to give credence and finally identify the ethnicity of the native original Texans, Los Tejanos. And the next thing I got to say, I found Dr. Cummins, Light Cummins, a very interesting, very informative and enlightening presentation. And I found it very interesting that he's the one that mentioned Tejanos the most of the other presenters. And I really enjoyed his presentation. I do have a question for Dr. Almaraz, and that's when he said the Mexican insurgents. Were they actually New Spain insurgents?
Yes.
Thank you.
Insurgent was preferred as an identity as opposed to revolutionaries. Filibusters have, as Dr. Cummings pointed out, filibusters were from out of town. They were soldiers of fortune. I was asked that question, what was the origin of filibusters in Mexico City by the Irish ambassador to Mexico? And I could only start with the French pirates in the Caribbean and then to the English pirates. And he did some research in Ireland and found that there was an antecedent, and that was the Dutch pirates. So, but it meant the same, freebooters, pirates, looking for full employment opportunities.
Thank you.
I'll throw one at y'all. I think most of us are familiar with Juan Seguin and how he basically ended up being torn between two cultures, what the Anglos that were moving into Texas and the Tejanos. But I was wondering if Lorenzo de Zavala was from Yucatan and not Texas. When he came up here, was he ever treated any differently? Was there any understandings that he was not a local, like we all do something like that? You're not from here, you're from somewhere else?
He didn't live long enough, so we won't know. I'm serious. He arrived in 1835. He sided with the insurgents, the revolutionaries, whatever term you want to use for them. He became vice president of the Republic, not by election, but by selection of the convention. The elections were held after the success of the revolution, and then crossing the San Jacinto in a rowboat with his son. His son fell overboard. He went in to save him, saved his son, but caught pneumonia himself and died. So he didn't live long enough to do anything but establish a legacy for himself as the great Mexican patriot who saw the justice of the Texas cause. And so he's honored in Texas that way. Ironically, if Santa Anna is the one man that both Mexicans and Texans can agree to hate, Lorenzo de Zavala is the man whom Texans love and Mexicans hate. He's seen as a great traitor to Mexico for his actions in Texas. So he's found very few defenders south of the border. But of course, the Tejano community had very little knowledge of him. He wasn't a Tejano, like I said. He only arrived in 1835. So he's an interesting individual in that sense that even unlike Juan Seguin, who is 5 generations Tejano, Lorenzo de Zavala was a native of the Yucatan and didn't get to establish his bona fides here. His kids did, however, and Adina de Zavala went on to be one of the great historic preservationists, particularly in the San Antonio area, and helped save the Alamo. So it's an interesting family story, but Lorenzo's is cut short by death.
All right, thank you, Frank. We could probably carry on for another 2 hours with the session. There are a lot of interesting questions that are going to have to remain unanswered. Please give our three speakers another great round of applause.